All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really compelling theory about where America's deep cultural divide comes from, and it's all based on some fascinating and, I gotta say, pretty sobering research.
Okay, let's just dive right in, because it's a question so many of us are asking, right? Why does it feel like we're living in two totally different countries? Well, the source material we're digging into today makes the case that this divide, it isn't just about politics. It's about something much deeper, something at the very foundation of what we believe.
The whole analysis really kicks off with this one, kind of shocking number. According to recent data, just 4%, of American adults actually hold a consistent biblical worldview. That is a massive, massive shift in the country's underlying beliefs, and it really sets the stage for everything else we're about to get into.
So we're going to approach this almost like a doctor's diagnosis. First, we're going to identify the symptom, what the source calls the Great Disalignment. Then we'll look for the root cause, this 50-year shift that happened inside the church. After that, we'll check out the new faith that this shift created, and finally, we'll see how a few external forces basically threw a whole lot of fuel on the fire.
Okay, so let's start by putting a name to the core problem. The source calls it the Great Disalignment, and what it really boils down to is a fundamental disagreement over, well, everything. Truth, what it means to be human, and our basic sense of right and wrong. Yeah, this goes way deeper than just policies or politicians. The source calls it an ontological divide. Now, that's a pretty big phrase, but all it really means is that we're not even agreeing on what reality is anymore. It's a split right down to the very foundations of how we see the world.
So, how in the world did we get here? Well, the analysis points to a 50-year transformation, not in Washington, but inside the American church itself. It's all about a massive shift in how faith was taught. Or, maybe more accurately, how it wasn't taught.
And this timeline just lays it all out so clearly. You can see the evolution. We went from the flake era, which was all about Sunday school and getting organized, to the bus ministry of the 70s, which was basically a logistics game. Then came the huge game changer, the seeker-sensitive model, in the 80s, which used marketing to appeal to people's felt needs. And even the more recent missional model, for all its focus on community, kind of continued that trend away from deep theological teaching and toward mass appeal.
And this really gets to the heart of it, right? The contrast is just stark. The original model was all about deep, personal investment. It created producers of faith. The modern attractional model, though, it became about broadcasting a message from a professional staff to an audience of, well, consumers. One creates disciples, the other creates spectators.
So what happens when you make this kind of dramatic shift in strategy? Well, you don't just get less informed churchgoers. According to this research, you end up producing a completely different kind of faith, one that sociologists have actually given a very specific and I think very telling name.
Moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD for short. The source describes this as the new standard worldview, even for a lot of people who would still call themselves Christian. It's basically a version of faith that works like therapy. The main goal is to feel good about yourself, not to wrestle with those historic, and let's be honest, often difficult doctrines.
And what's so interesting is when you look at these 5 core beliefs, they sound pretty reasonable to a lot of us. But when you put them all together, they create what the source calls Christianity without the cross. It's a faith where God is kind of a cosmic therapist you call on when you're in trouble, and the main point of life is just to be happy and be a nice person.
And this just lays the disconnect bare. The historic, biblical view sees humanity as fallen, as sinful, and needing grace. MTT, it says people are basically good at heart. One sees God as a sovereign Lord to be worshipped, the other sees a cosmic therapist on call. The entire purpose of life flips from glorifying God to just achieving personal happiness. And the data, wow, the data really shows how far this has spread. Look at this, 72% of self-identified Christians say they believe people are basically good. That is a core MTD belief, not a biblical one. And only 14% hold a traditionally biblical view of sin. The consumer model, it turns out, produced a consumer-friendly faith.
Okay, so you've got the church's discipleship model getting weaker and weaker, producing this MTD worldview. But nature abhors a vacuum, right? Another powerful force was stepping right into that gap, and it was actively shaping what Americans believed.
And that force,
the source argues, was the entertainment industry. It says Hollywood acts like an alternative discipleship engine. Through incredibly powerful storytelling, it teaches a completely different worldview, one where religion is just a private opinion, where divine providence is laughed off as mere coincidence, and where the whole point of life is just human flourishing here and now, with zero room for anything transcendent.
So that's the setup. You've got a weakened church on one side and a powerful secular culture on the other. And then two huge events came along that acted like catalysts, basically pouring gasoline on the fire and locking this whole divide firmly into place.
The first accelerant is what the source calls the Great Alignment. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It started way back in the 60s, the strategic merging of the Republican Party and white evangelicalism. But over the decades, it got to the point where, for many people, being religious became synonymous with a specific political party. And the effect of that was to push away anyone who didn't share those exact politics.
And then the pandemic hit. And man, it was a massive stress test for everything. Just look at this chart. It blew the doors wide open on this ideological divide. After the pandemic, there is now a massive 26-point gap in who never attends church between liberals and conservatives. For millions, church was just a habit that was pretty easy to drop, which kicked this great de-churching into overdrive.
So let's put it all together. Here's the final diagnosis. The key takeaway is that these forces didn't act alone. They all fed each other. You had the pre-existing condition, a weak, consumer-driven church. Then you had the formative virus, Hollywood's alternative discipleship. The pandemic was the stress test that forced a choice. And finally, the political alignment sorted everybody into their consolidated tribes.
But this is where the whole thing takes a really interesting and frankly surprising turn. The analysis doesn't just end in doom and gloom. It actually suggests that this huge collapse, it isn't necessarily the end of the story. It might actually be clearing the ground for something new to grow. A smaller, but maybe more authentic and less politically charged form of faith. Which leaves all of us with one last, pretty provocative thought to chew on. If the program-driven church of the last 50 years helped create this deep divide, what kind of church, what kind of community could possibly begin to heal it? That is a question that's going to shape America's cultural and spiritual landscape for decades to come.